Up to now, I've covered 2 of the modern Persona games, Persona 4 and Persona 5. Well, we only got one left. Hello everyone. Persona 3 originally released for the PS2 back in 2006. I played it for the first time in 2023, so I apologize for being late to the party. If you've seen my video on Persona 4 or Persona 5, this video will be formatted pretty similarly to those videos. I will split each major part of gameplay into its own section and talk about them individually. If you haven't seen the Persona 4 and Persona 5 videos and are curious, the links will be in the description for anyone who wants to watch. This is an old game, but I will still be going over the full game, including the story. So, if you don't want to get spoiled, I suggest coming back after you've beaten it. If you end up liking the video here today, like and subscribe for more Persona content in the future. But with all that out of the way, let's talk about Persona 3. Let's talk about the characters. Now I'm only going to be talking about the main cast, that being the members of SEES, as I'll talk more about the villains later. Starting with the first main character you meet, Yukari. Yukari is pretty good, definitely a great character, but would I say she's my favorite? Probably not. I mean, she feels important to the story since her dad worked at the Grigio group that ended up creating the main dungeon of the game Tartarus, and she definitely feels a lot more like a real person compared to a character like Chie from Persona 4. A big part of her storyline is her strained relationship with her mother after her father passed, and I thought that was pretty interesting, but outside of that, there honestly wasn't too much that I really latched onto. The next main character to join the party is Junpei, a guy at school that decides to join SEES because he has the power of Persona. When I first started playing the game, he was definitely comparable to Yosuke from Persona 4 or Ryuji from Persona 5, being a best friend type character. And in my opinion at the time, he was definitely the weakest of the 3. Junpei didn't really have much reason to be in SEES in my eyes, and he didn't really have some big reason to want to fight Shadows and join SEES. But of course, that was a part of the story, and when Chidori's storyline got introduced, he quickly became one of my favorite characters because he had one of the best developments in the game. And they'll cover more of that storyline in the story section. Similar to Junpei, Akihiko is definitely a character that grew on me as the game went on. His storyline surrounding Shinjiro is definitely what made me grow in the character. Another thing I like about Akihiko is I think the writers did a really good job making a more grounded, serious character have some quirkier sides to him. Like, sure, for most of the main story, he's kind of serious and brooding compared to someone like Junpei, but when you go into battle and he says, "Oh, you've been waiting for this," it gets me every time. I think out of all the male characters in this game, I think Akihiko is definitely one I like the most, but there are other characters I liked more. Fuka was not one of them. Like, she's not annoying or anything, she's not an annoying character, but there's just something there I don't really like. Fuka is the character you save from Tartarus after some girls bullying her, put her into the school at night, left her overnight, and then she got trapped in Tartarus. And then the girls that were bullying her disappeared. That's a pretty strong introduction to a character. I don't really have a problem with how she was introduced. It's just her personality is just... Maybe it's because the voice actress that portrayed her didn't really do that good of a job in my eyes. Or her personality was shy, but they didn't really do her shyness in a way that was interesting. But hey, at least she's not Teddy. Let's move on from probably my least favorite character to one of my favorites, Mitsuru. Out of all the characters that survived to the end of the game, in my opinion, Mitsuru definitely fits the more dark tone of this game the best. Being the president of the student council at her school, she's definitely a very smart character. It also helps the voice actress that plays Mitsuru is the same voice actress to voice Edelgard, so that definitely helps. Additionally, she has a lot of spunkiness when she goes into battle, outright telling Shadows that they're not worthy of her time. And for most of the game, Mitsuru was my favorite character. But in my opinion, her character is beaten by the robot, I guess. If Mitsuru is a character that fits into the game's major tones, then Aigis is the character that fits perfectly into the game's major themes. She is a robot that was literally designed to fight Shadows. Aigis is a robot, so obviously she's not alive, but as she creates new friends with SEES, and learns about their experiences throughout the game, she slowly becomes more and more human, till the final scene in the game where she cries. Her personality at times can be kind of funny and kind of serious depending on the situation, which I really appreciate. And I gotta get props for the voice actress that plays her, as she did a really good job making Aigis sound less and less robotic throughout the game. Yeah, without a doubt, Aigis is definitely the best character in the game. The next main character that joins SEES is Koromaru, and he's a dog, so I really don't have anything to say about him. He does have a backstory, but again, he's a dog. Best character though. Ken, he's okay. It's really hard to make child characters really interesting in the video game, and I think they did a decent job here. His motivation for joining SEES is to actually kill one of its members, Shinjiro. The reason he wanted to kill him was because of his mother's death being caused by him. But just like Fuka, just because Ken is introduced in a cool way, doesn't mean I'm gonna end up liking him in the end, because he was pretty boring. Or at least he became boring after his main storyline with Shinjiro was finished. Speaking of Shinjiro, the last party member to join SEES is Shinjiro. The thing about Shinjiro is that you don't really learn that much about him. I mean, sure you do learn bits and pieces about his backstory and a tiny bit about his personality, but he's intentionally a character that you're not meant to learn a ton about, for obvious reasons. But I think the stuff that we did end up learning about Shinjiro was pretty interesting. And that was all the main cast of Persona 3, a very solid group of characters. I know I said I wasn't going to talk about the side characters, but there's one specifically that I want to talk about. Now, I'm not saying that this is the only good side character, but by far, he was my favorite. I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone that Akinari is my favorite side character in this game. Akinari is a man destined to die at an early age due to a genetic condition. In the midst of all that, he also wants to write a story, but is having trouble doing so. Akinari's journey to writing the story and being closer and closer to his inevitable death is a very sad and touching story that ends on a good note. He still ends up dying when the social link is over, but he manages to finish his book, and it ends up being made. And that is all the characters I want to discuss in this section. We definitely ended on the good note. But now with all that over, let's move on to the main story of Persona 3. Compared to Persona 4 and Persona 5, the story format of Persona 3 is a lot looser. Persona 4 and 5 went along these arcs. For Persona 4, it was whoever's in the TV at the time, and for Persona 5, it was the villain the Phantom Thieves would change the heart of. Persona 3 kind of goes along the same structure, but it is a little bit different. I mean, sure, every 30 days or so on the full moon, you will be fighting a shadow, but that doesn't necessarily mean the main story beats will happen on that day. Another thing about the story that is a much slower pace compared to the other two games, because from like April to about August, the story is pretty slow. It's just introducing characters and you're out killing shadows. Because outside of the immensely creepy opening that set up the game's tone really well, it went on kind of slow. You're just like, oh, there's a shadow. Go kill that now. To be fair though, the main part of the opening game is to imagine that you're getting closer to saving the world by killing the shadows that are plaguing the city. So I don't really think its slow opening takes away from the story at all. But as I mentioned earlier, this game is dark. As you go through the month, as you get closer and closer to the full moon, more of what the game calls the Lost showed up. Basically zombified people that are incapable of talking or doing any functions. And of course, the main theme of Persona 3 is death. So, how do you summon your persona in this game?
I summon thee!
Yeah, you shoot yourself in the head. Now, I'm not criticizing the game for this, but that's weird. And overall, Persona 3 just has a much darker atmosphere compared to Persona 4, which I definitely appreciated. But as you go throughout the early game, you're introduced to members of SEES, which is essentially the investigation team or the Phantom Thieves of this game. I've already talked about SEES in the previous segment, but overall, they're a pretty unique group since you're not the one to create SEES. You kind of just join in when you move to Iwatodai. To be honest though, I honestly don't really have that much to talk about with the early game. A lot of it is just set up for when the main part of the story happens later on in the game. Despite not being too heavy on story, the game does have some good moments in the early part though. So I'll do my best to mention as many of them as I can. As I talked about earlier, Fuka's introduction is pretty great. It's very creepy and it fits the tone of the game really well, since her introduction is about her being a bully girl who disappears and takes all of her bullies with her. Another thing I want to mention that there's a lot of distrust in the party. Not everyone trusts everyone, and I thought that was pretty cool. Or at least there's a lot of distrust between Yukari and Mitsuru and Akihiko. And it's for more than one reason too. Since up to that point, there hadn't been a complete reason on why they're fighting shadows, or why they kept recruiting people like Fuka. I'm not saying I prefer one style over the other, but it was definitely a nice contrast to Persona 4, where they all just seem buddy-buddy with each other. Before I get into the meat of the story, I do want to talk about one of the game's major villains, Strega. Strega as a group is probably the most prominent villain in the game, as the two other major villains are villains you're not meant to know are villains until they are revealed. But Strega really just isn't that interesting to me. They're basically just characters that you fight so you don't have to constantly fight nameless shadows the entire time. But they're, well, at least the main leader Takai's motivation is, the world screwed me, so I'm gonna screw the world. Not the most riveting stuff, but whatever. The story eventually starts to pick up around August. At this point, a lot of storylines begin to sprout. Beginning with one of the best storylines in the entire game, the Junpei Chidori storyline. Since Chidori is a member of Strega, she is sent to spy on Junpei and try to figure out who is the leader of C's. But of course, they start the bond, so that all goes away. I mean, I still think Chidori is kind of boring as a character, but her role in the story does a lot to progress Junpei's character, which ended up making him one of my favorites. After several scenes of interacting, Chidori would eventually kidnap Junpei to force him to tell her who the leader of C's is, which of course backfires and she ends up being placed in a hospital where it is revealed that she can't summon her persona naturally, so her persona will eventually kill her. I think that was a pretty interesting reveal, as it reveals that Chidori will eventually die from her persona, as well as the rest of the members of Strega and Shinjiro. But after a good month of being in the spotlight for the story, she basically goes on sabbatical until the story needs her again. I mean, she still shows up in scenes with Junpei and stuff like that, but Strega is the main villain group of the game, yet they take 2 months to realize she could be in a hospital. Like, I don't know, maybe they were just trying to delay her death, or more likely to include more scenes of her and Junpei so that her inevitable death is more impactful. The next storyline I want to talk about is the one between Shinjiro and Ken. Ken joins C's around August, and then Shinjiro, hearing this, joins a week later. And through that entire month or so, those two are very distant from each other, saying very vague lines over their true intentions. That all comes to a head on October 4th, which is revealed to be the day Ken's mother died due to Shinjiro's persona going berserk. What ensues is a confrontation between Ken and Shinjiro where Ken plans to kill him. Ken decides not to kill Shinjiro, but at that time the leader of Strega shows up and decides to kill them both. Takaya ends up shooting Shinjiro, and before he can shoot Ken, Shinjiro blocks the bullet. Now, for this scene, I think your level of surprise will be depending on which route you played. Whether you played the male protagonist route, you'll probably be surprised, but if you played the female protagonist route, it'll probably be a lot more obvious. Now regardless, it's a really good scene with a lot of suspense, but it doesn't help that I'm literally just looking at character portraits. But with that, that's more a problem with Persona 3 Portable rather than Persona 3 as a whole. It's at this point in the game I think the game really hit its stride, because it was at this point in the game I really became invested. Well, after some scenes of the group mourning his death and some Persona awakenings, the group finally kills the last shadow and puts an end to the Dark Hour. But except of course they didn't, and they ended up screwing themselves. Because that whole time they were taking orders from C's overseer, Shuji Akusugi, guess what? He's a twist villain! Because the whole time they were killing shadows, Akusugi was showing them doctored footage that was basically telling them that killing the shadows would remove the Dark Hour. Except what they were actually doing is making it possible for Nyx to descend to the world and destroy it. So then after capturing the group, he tries to sacrifice them by using Aigis to kill them, but then he ends up dying alongside Mitsuru's father. Just like Strega, I'm not that big of a fan of Akusugi as a villain. Like, it's not like he came out of nowhere, in fact he probably was too obvious. I felt like his whole point was to be a twist villain, as he didn't really have much personality or motivations outside of just being against C's. So yeah, so far the villains in Persona 3 aren't that great. The death of Mitsuru's father served the same purpose as Shinjiro's death, but it didn't really have the same amount of impact. His death does bring about character development in Mitsuru, but unlike Shinjiro, you only meet her father once before the day of his death. So just as obvious as it was that Akusugi was going to be a villain, it was also incredibly obvious that Mitsuru's father would end up dying. I'm not saying that story sequence is bad in general, it just wasn't my favorite moment of the game. Not too long after, we are introduced to a new main character, Ryoji. Now, since I'm assuming most of the people watching this video have already played Persona 3, you already know that Ryoji is going to end up being the main villain. Unlike Akusugi and Strega, however, Ryoji is actually a pretty well-written villain. Ryoji is initially introduced as a normal transfer student, but obviously the game points out that there's something underneath the surface. Additionally, he also has the same voice as Pharos, a kid in your head, and the voice of the protagonist, so I don't think it was ever really meant to be a twist villain. Of course, he will eventually be revealed to be Nyx, the final boss, but before I get to that, I want to talk about one more character death. In the middle of the month in November, out of nowhere, Chidori escapes from the hospital. When the group finds her, she tries to fight them, but then she goes down in 2 hits, basically. After the easiest boss fight is over, though, the rest of Strega emerges, and after a bit of conversing, they shoot Junpei. But of course, Junpei is not the one to die, as Chidori uses the last of her persona's magic to save him and sacrifice herself. Junpei's persona ends up merging with Chidori's persona, creating one of the last persona awakenings in the game. To be honest, as much as I think the death of Shinjiro is more important to the story, I actually prefer how they do Chidori's death here. What I like about it here is that it's not on a full moon. Her death happens in the middle of a month when you're not even prepared for it. The scene also does a bait and switch to make you think Junpei might be the one to die. And I think her death happening in the middle of the month helped the game's major themes, being learning to not dread death and to learn to live in the present. Shinjiro's death and even Mitsuru's father's death definitely do apply to the theme, but I think Chidori's did it the best. Chidori's death obviously hits Junpei pretty hard, and that makes Ryoji closer to the group by him comforting Junpei. Aga still doesn't trust him, and it all comes to a head on the 1st December full moon. Ryoji is of course revealed to be the human version of Nyx, basically the shadow version of the 13th Arcana, Death. It is revealed that around 10 years or so prior to the game's events, Aigis was fighting Ryoji, and failed. Her only option was to seal him in a human that was standing nearby, the protagonist. That is why for most of the game, the protagonist was interacting with a character named Pharos that nobody else could see, because Pharos was another version of Ryoji, who was already another version of Nyx. Aigis ends up trying to attack Ryoji but fails. What surprised me the most is that Ryoji ended up not acting evil towards the group even after he realized he was Nyx. Instead, he tells them about the incoming future of the world. Since Seize killed the 12 shadows and Akutsi's gambit working, Nyx will eventually come down to the world and wipe out every living being on the planet. Ryoji tells the group that Nyx ascending to the earth is inevitable, and he gives them two choices. Either they let Ryoji live and live the rest of their lives fearing the incoming death of humanity, trying to defeat Nyx when defeating Nyx is impossible, or they can kill Ryoji, forgetting all their memories of the Dark Hour and their work as Seize, living the rest of their lives in blissful ignorance until the day of their death. Ryoji gives them the rest of December to decide, and that whole month is dedicated to the group trying to decide. The question that Ryoji asks is a very interesting one, as you're basically deciding how you want to die. Obviously, Seize will end up finding a way to save humanity, but if I were given the choice, I would have no idea what to do. And what's even cooler is that you actually get the choice to decide. On the 31st, you can choose to either spare Ryoji or kill Ryoji. Obviously, the best ending would be to spare Ryoji, but what's cool is that it's not immediately obvious. For example, Persona 4, you have the option to side with the killer, but it should come immediately obvious that you're siding with a serial killer, so there's not really a moral dilemma there. So I really commend Persona 3 for having a not obvious choice, at least initially, as throughout the month, the party members will slowly begin to understand that they need to fight Nyx and not just give in, making it abundantly clear that the right choice is to spare Ryoji. So yet again, you kinda have to go out of your way to get the bad ending. I feel like the reason they did this is because it's a video game, so they don't want the player to stress out worrying if they're gonna get the worst ending out of the two. So I kinda get why they did this. Either way though, it was a really interesting dilemma leading up to the ending split. I'm gonna focus on the true ending path though. After sparing Ryoji, he tells them how to fight Nyx. By ascending to the top of the tower Tartarus on the final day, they will be able to fight Nyx. And then the game progresses to its final month, January. January is by far the best month in the game. In this month, the world is getting closer and closer to ending, and the people in the town realize that. More of the Lost showed up, people start freaking out and joining cults. The main one being started by Strega that actually is celebrating the end of the world. It's very similar to the month of December in Persona 4, but the difference between that and this is that in Persona 3, the music, instead of becoming creepy and ominous like Persona 4's, becomes sad and reflective. The overworld becomes all messy, there's less people walking around, and there's posters lying all over the floor. It added a lot to the tone and atmosphere of Persona 3 Portable that couldn't really do so normally because of the 2D backgrounds. There's a lot of great little moments that happened in January as well. Junpei's speech to the protagonist was great, the dinner scene with Seize was great, and best part was Aigis becoming more human. I feel that January is where Aigis really came into her own as a character and became my favorite. Obviously the month goes on and the world gets closer and closer to ending. Before you fight Nyx though, you get one more motivational speech from your teacher, and then it's time. On January 31st, the last floors of Tartarus appear, but before you fight Nyx, Strega appears for the final time, and after you beat them, they reveal stuff about their backstory. But like I've said, Strega is boring, so I'm not gonna get into it. But speaking of Nyx, Nyx is probably my second favorite final boss out of the 3 Persona games I've played, only being beaten by the final palace ruler of Persona 5. The reason Nyx worked well as a final boss was not necessarily because of its actions, it's just, it was very intimidating. Obviously I knew since it was a video game you're gonna end up winning, but the game outright tells you that there's no way you can kill it. Even after you beat the thing in combat, you didn't really kill it, you killed an avatar of it So it was like that hour-long boss fight was for nothing, barely putting a dent into Nyx, which is why I think Nyx works so well as a villain. After the fight, the party is forced down, being unable to move, and Nyx is revealed to be the moon. And then the moon starts falling. And then the main character ends up rising into the moon for the final fight. Sound familiar? That's my one gripe about the final part of the game. Otherwise it's great, but going into the moon is already part of a game I've played before, being The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. And the games came out around the same time, so I'm not really sure if that was intentional or not. Moving back along though, the protagonist with the power of his friends is given the final ability, the Great Seal, to be able to seal Nyx away, costing all of his health points. But let's move on to the ending. After holding back Nyx, the Dark Hour disappears, alongside the party's memories of the Dark Hour. The party gets to live peaceful days due to what they've done, and the 2 days leading up to the ending are due to talking to all the social links you've maxed out. Some of them will comment on the main character feeling tired or looking ill, and when you go back to the dorm on the 2 days, you have to immediately go to bed. On the day of March 5th though, Aigis will wake you up telling you that she remembers everything about Seas, and of course, being the main character, you do too. The two decide to go to the roof where the group had promised to meet after they'd won. The rest of the group eventually remembers and decides to meet them on the roof as well. But before that happens, Aigis and the main character talk about the meaning of life, which kinda sounds corny saying it out loud, but trust me, it's a really good scene. The game will continue to comment on how the main character is feeling tired. Before the rest of the party comes, the game tells you that you have to close your eyes to progress, and when you do, the main character dies. Because the ability that cost all your health that you had to use to defeat Nyx wasn't nearly there for style, and then the main character dies in Aigis' arms. Yeah, this is by far the best Persona ending. The game doesn't outright tell you that the main character dies, you kinda have to figure it out on your own, and I really appreciate it for that. Now with that being said, Persona 3 still isn't my favorite Persona story. I think Persona 5 and 4s are definitely a lot more interesting to me, but this is definitely the best ending of the 3. I'll go as far to say that this might be one of my favorite game endings ever, as the ending stuck with me long after I beat the game, a feat that only 2 other games that I can think of have. So to conclude this long story section, the story of Persona 3 definitely isn't perfect, but it's still really amazing. Now let's finally get into the gameplay. Now if you've seen my Persona 4 or Persona 5 video, you probably already expect what I'm gonna say, but yeah, I really like the combat. Out of all the RPGs I've played, Persona definitely has my favorite type of combat. The one more system is just so fun. Being able to target enemies' weaknesses and knock them all down, then finish them off with the all-out attack is just so fun to do because it offers a lot of strategy potential. Persona 3's combat is very similar to Persona 4's combat, having basically the same enemies outside of bosses and having all the same elements. The only element that is different is that physical attacks in Persona 4 have been split into 3, Slash, Strike, and Pierce. And that made the combat more interesting because the weapons now do different things, and since physical attacks are split into 3 in this game, it makes it a lot more complicated, which I like. In fact, Persona 3 even has more types of physical attacks than even Persona 5 did, even if Persona 5 has more types in general. Here's the thing though, I realize that this game came out in 2006 originally, but this is still a way grindier game than Persona 4 or Persona 5. I always liked that Persona wasn't really a grindy type of RPG, which is something I don't like. Persona 3 definitely isn't the grindiest RPG I've ever played, but I was definitely under-leveled more than I thought I was when I was fighting bosses, which required me to go to Tartarus more and fight more of the same enemies. Luckily though, Persona isn't the hardest game ever, so that even if I was under-leveled when it came to a boss, I was always able to defeat it, even if it did cost a little bit of my items. A big part of Persona is training the Personas, obviously, so that you will be able to defeat the enemies that come your way. In my Persona 4 and Persona 5 video, I really didn't have much to say on it, as I think it was implemented in a really fun way, as it was really fun to make the most powerful Persona you can, with a bunch of different moveset possibilities. With Persona 3, it's significantly less fun. See, instead of being able to manually choose what abilities you want to travel on, it's all random. So if you didn't get the abilities you want, you'd have to close out and manually select the Personas you're fusing again, until you get the right ability, or you give up. Which is really tedious and takes away from the whole making your Persona your own. And what's worse is that there are several different side quests that require you to get a Persona with a certain ability, meaning it's even harder to figure out what Personas you need to fuse in general, in addition to having to wait till the game decides to let you have that ability. The worst instance for me is when I had to fuse an Alice with Megiddo for a quest. It ended up taking me 15 minutes of just hearing the select sound effect, and having to go back and hope you get the right thing for 15 straight minutes. I want to move on from that to a smaller gripe I have. Some of the attacks in this game are described kind of poorly. The multi-hit attack, specifically Blaze of Fury, which I use the most, is described as just a medium slash attack, when in reality is attack that's supposed to attack 4 to 6 times. Now, again, it's really not that big of a gripe, but I just kind of felt the need to bring it up here. As far as the quality of the boss goes, it's pretty good in this game. There are some bosses I really liked. For example, the fight you're seeing right now against the Fortune and Strength Shadows is really fun as you use a Wheel of Fortune mechanic to either do damage or a status ailment to you or your enemy. The other one I really liked being the final fight, being 13 phases against Nyx. A very climactic fight going through the first 13 phases of the Arcana deck, which Persona already used to categorize its social links. The rest of the fights I don't have too much to say on, other than they are pretty good. I won't call the bosses better than the ones in Persona 5, but really, can you blame it? The game came out 17 years ago, and still managed to have a pretty good set of bosses. The last thing I want to talk about with the main combat is the party members. Instead of talking about each party member individually like I did for my Persona 4 and Persona 5 video, I would just be discussing them as a whole. And as I've seen through all 3 of the games I've played, the party is pretty balanced for the most part. My party composition with the male route was completely different with the female route, and in both routes I managed to do pretty well. I think out of all the party members, not including the protagonist, Mitsuru and Aigis are definitely the most powerful, since Mitsuru had Mind Charge, meaning she did a lot of damage, and Aigis having a lot of versatility. The 2 weakest were definitely Junpei and Ken, because I never really had a use for my team and never really did that much. The rest of the cast was pretty balanced. Overall, I didn't like the combat as much as Persona 4 or 5, but it was still definitely a ton of fun. Persona 3 does dungeons differently than the other 2 games, in that Persona 3 really only has 1 dungeon. Throughout the entire game, you'll be ascending through the floors of Tartarus, over 250 of them. There's definitely a crap ton of floors at Tartarus, but luckily, compared to Persona 4, the floors go by a lot quicker. And by quicker, I mean the floors are smaller, so you don't have to go through as much land. But there are enemies that you have to grind to get up to the level you need to be for the next boss, so you still need to fight them, which increases the time you'll be in Tartarus. Even still though, 250 plus floors is a lot compared to Persona 4 that really only had 70 longer ones. Of course, Persona 3 doesn't really have much in terms of dungeon design, so there's not really much to discuss there, as each floor is randomly generated. Visually though, Tartarus is kind of bland. Each major block you go up in Tartarus does have its different theme, but the themes aren't really that interesting, as they really don't apply to anything in particular. And since you're going up like 20-30 floors per block, it never really is that interesting. One thing I will give it credit for though is I really like the background music becoming more clearer and louder, adding more instruments as you climb through Tartarus. Especially towards the end when you're in the final block of Tartarus when the music reaches its final stage, and you really feel like you're towards the end. And that's pretty much all I have to say on Tartarus. There's definitely a shorter section compared to my other sections, but because it's auto-generated, not really having much puzzles or depth outside of being able to climb up floors fighting enemies, not really having much cool visual themes, and literally only being 1 dungeon you go to, Tartarus really doesn't have that much for me to grasp onto. I definitely didn't hate it, but there's also nothing about Tartarus that made me go, wow, this is such a fun dungeon. It was kinda just a way for my party to get up to the level they needed to be for the next boss. Which I get is kind of the point. But since my first Persona game was 5, and that game had amazing dungeons that served for more than 1 piece of gameplay, I guess that means that Tartarus would disappoint me a little bit, even if I did enjoy Tartarus overall. You might have noticed that the presentation of the story scenes and world exploration is different than the other Persona games. That's because the version of Persona 3 that I played was Persona 3 Portable that originally came out on the PSP, which didn't allow for much 3D exploration. That means that story scenes that might look like this ends up looking like this with just character portraits. Although I vastly prefer 3D character models, I don't really mind the character portraits because they look really nice. What stinks though is that the backgrounds behind the characters don't really look that good. For moving around the world, that means you just move with the pointer on the screen and select stuff you want to do rather than walking around. And again, I vastly prefer being able to move around, but it actually works pretty well here as it leads to a quicker paced game. I think the lack of 3D models and having to use a visual novel style definitely hurts the game, but that's not really Persona 3, that's mostly a Persona 3 portable thing. I think my immersion of the world definitely would have been helped if it was a 3D exploration, but this version's the only one I have access to, so it's whatever. Let's move on to the world and what there is to do. First off, the social links. Of course, I like the social link system in general, being able to go around people in the world, learning more about their story and growing closer to them. But I think Persona 3 has the weakest of the three systems. Now, this leads more into story and character side of things, but in general, I just don't think the social links are as good of a quality compared to the other two games. There's only 3 I genuinely cared about outside of the main party, and there were 2 social links I actually thought was bad. The difference between the social link systems in 3 compared to 4 and 5 is the ability to reverse them. This is also present in Persona 4 to some extent, but definitely not as prevalent as here. In the male protagonist route, every female confidant could be reversed if you say the wrong things to them, or don't talk to them within a certain period of time. Basically, if you get these female confidants to a certain rank, they will basically not want you to talk to any other female character that you can interact with, which, in my opinion, is a bit too far. A big reason I didn't finish one of the social links in Persona 3 was because I had to focus on a different social link so that one didn't reverse. But I think the idea of social links being able to reverse if you say the wrong thing is a good idea. Either they should have basically removed it in general, or just went all out with it and made every social link have that mechanic. Because although the mechanic does add a lot of strategy in which social links you do at what time, it already had that even without it. The female route does differ from the male route when it comes to that kind of stuff, but since I'm going to have a whole section on that route, I'm going to avoid talking about it for now. The last thing I want to say in the social links is that in the male route, it forces you to date every single female confidant you max out. So in the end, if you want to get all the social links, you're going to have to cheat on like 6 different girls. I mean, that's weird on its own, but I get that this was like the first modern Persona game or whatever, but didn't the devs making this game ever think, that's a little weird? Like, I don't know, that kind of stuff isn't the main reason I play Persona, so being forced to do it when I could easily just have a way to say no, it's kind of weird. Outside of social links though, there's not really much to offer in terms of stuff to do. There's less of the reason to do social stats because only 3 of the possible social links actually require it, and that's 3 of the 4 party members you can actually interact with, at least in the male route. Sure, having a lot of knowledge does help with tests, which does give you rewards, but other than that, they really just serve as barriers for the 3 social links. And despite the game taking place in the city, there's surprisingly little else to do here. If you're not raising a social link at a certain shop, then you're doing the video games, as it gives bonus stat points to your personas. And what's even worse is that the main thing you'll be doing, being social links, it will be taken away from you during certain periods of the game. Specifically during the summer months, we can only do the people outside of school. So if you're unlucky like me in my first playthrough, when I mostly focus on the people outside of school, then I'll basically have nothing to do in the summer months, which ended up screwing me over on the final day when I was 1 away from being able to max out every social links but missing it by 1. And what's worse is that it happens 2 or 3 times during the story with varying lengths for each of them. The actual world of Iwatodai is pretty cool, as it fits in with Persona 3's more creepy nature, especially when the Lost come in. Again though, I prefer the main locations of the other 2 games more. One thing I noticed though when I was playing is that there were a lot of lines that are untranslated. The one that was most glaring to me were a couple social link ones, and an epilogue scene with Shinjiro in the female route. Basically, lines that were supposed to be written in English were still in Japanese. It only happened a few times when I noticed, but still something I want to bring up, even though it wasn't uber annoying. Overall, the non-combat gameplay and the world of Persona 3 as a whole is definitely really good, but it definitely got better as the series went along. For most of this video, I've only been talking about experience with the male protagonist route, while briefly mentioning some stuff about the female route. Now, of course, in Persona 3 Portable, there is a female protagonist, which does alter the gameplay and story, so I want to talk about them here. The female route has a lot of different social links compared to the male route. A lot of the social links in the male route have been completely taken out and replaced with other ones, mostly party members. So, in this route, you can finally be able to have a social link with Junpei, Akihiko, Shinjiro, Ken, and even Koromaru. There's also 3 different social links that are added outside of the main party, Ryoji, and 2 female side characters that replace the Chariot and Hermit Arcana. Obviously, to have the alternate social links for the female route, they need to replace some with the male route. Luckily, the ones they replaced in the female route weren't nearly my favorites in the game, so I'm pretty happy. And I think the female route has a superior social links to the male route. There is 2 social links I want to talk about specifically, the new social link with Ryoji and the social link with Shinji. Let's talk about the one with Ryoji first. I really like this social link. It gives even more of a chance to talk about how Ryoji's not necessarily evil, he's just kind of forced to do the deed of Nyx. Because, you know, he is Nyx. His social link offers more glimpses into him becoming close with C's, and offers more foreshadowing for his eventual reveal. It's a really good social link, probably a top 5 in the entire game. Now let's talk about the one with Shinjiro. probably another top 5 social link in the entire game. Similarly to Ryoji's social link, this social link offers more opportunity to know Shinjiro as a character that the mail route really couldn't offer, as well as a build-up for his eventual fate. This social link made me like Shinjiro as a character way more, and the more you do the social link, the more impacted you will be by his death, so it should make that moment even more impactful than the mail route. Sadly, it doesn't work like this, and instead of having the death be even more impactful, they erased it entirely if you maxed his social link out. For some reason, giving him his leather watch back and becoming best friends with him overrules his entire death. Instead, he goes into a coma for the rest of the game, still being out of the story, but lessening the impact of the characters reacting to his death, and his death in general. Apparently, Shinjiro is not the only one whose death you can reverse. I didn't personally get this, but after doing some research, if you talk to Junpei enough during the month of November, you can actually reverse Chidori's death. She still ends up dying on that day, but she ends up being brought back to life due to the power of love like it's a frickin' Disney movie. Now, this isn't exclusive to the female route, but since I just talked about Shinji's death being reversed, I feel the need to bring it up here. Now, if you manage to do both of these death reversals in one playthrough, it really lessens the impacts these deaths have on the overall narrative. Persona 3 is all about death and finding peace, even within sorrow. So although it's a happy ending to bring them back to life, it also kind of ruins some of the character development and kind of makes it feel forced. And that's why I vastly preferred Ryoji's social link compared to the Shinjiro's, because no matter if you max out Ryoji's social link or not, he will become Nyx and be the final boss. So that social link only helps to make that moment even more impactful. And that's why, even though both of those social links were great, I definitely preferred Ryoji's a lot more. Luckily though, the social links in general fixed a lot of the issues I had with the social links in the mail route. They pulled back on a lot of the reversal stuff on the social links, only having one character, Akihiko I believe, that can actually reverse. Female route social links also fixed a lot of the little stuff, like not forcing you to date the characters you max the social links of if you're not into all that romancy stuff. Outside of social links, the female route has some unique scenes, like a school trip to Inaba from Persona 4 instead of the boring swim meet. The female route also has some unique music for the overworld, the battle theme, and the social link theme, and some of the alternate songs in the female route is even better than the songs in the male route. And that's all the major difference between the female route and the male route. Obviously, they didn't change any stuff with the gameplay, because why would they? They just changed up some story stuff and some social links. As far as which route I liked more, I'm pretty much split down the middle. I definitely appreciated some of the changes the female route did, but it also has its fair share of issues. I think in general, I'd be leaning towards the male route, as it was the first one I did. But I do think that the female route was pretty interesting. And that about covers it. That is pretty much all I have to say on Persona 3. Keep in mind, I probably did sound a little bit negative on stuff in the game, but I really did enjoy it a ton. Despite several flaws I have with the game, its story and characters are some of the best in the series. And as the first modern Persona, as people call it, it was a really, really fun experience. Playing Persona 3, 4, and 5 have given me some of my favorite characters in video games, some of my favorite moments playing, and now Persona is one of my favorite series. I was enthralled by the story and gameplay of Persona 5, the mystery and the small town feel of Persona 4, and the ending and atmosphere of Persona 3. I'll be waiting patiently for whenever Persona 6 finally gets announced. Here's hoping they put it on a Switch or whatever Nintendo platform it's on when it gets released, because I don't have a PS4 or a PS5. But I'm really happy I got to play these 3 games on the Switch, which are now some of my favorite games ever. If you want my ranking of the 3 games, I go Persona 5, Persona 4, and then Persona 3, the order I played it in. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching this video. This video took a lot of time to make, so I really hope you enjoyed it. Now, as of this video's release, I've played 4 Atlus games, Persona 3, Persona 4, Persona 5, and one other game. So hey, maybe I'll make a video on that one too. But again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.